Question orale, the Honourable Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the cover-up of sexual misconduct allegations against the former Chief of Defence Staff by this government is getting uglier and uglier by the day. The Prime Minister said he didn't know, but changes his story often. And just hours ago, the Liberal chair, for no reason, cancelled the committee meeting, shedding light on this very issue. The Liberals are clearly trying to run and hide. Last week in this House, the Prime Minister was asked 9 times that if he had known the allegations were sexual in nature, would he have dismissed General Vance? The Prime Minister wouldn't answer. Why is that?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've always respected the work done by my colleagues at the committee. For this study, I've appeared at the committee for 6 hours along with senior defense officials. The committee has also heard from Ray Novak, who laid out the process that was followed when rumors were brought forward in 2015. In fact, many questions remain unanswered from the leader of the official opposition on what he knew in 2015 when he brought forward those rumors and yet still appointed General Vance while he was under active investigation by the CFNIS. Thank you.
The Honourable Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when Conservatives heard rumors, we acted. When Liberals saw evidence, they ran and hid. It would appear the Prime Minister knew in 2018 he was facing much more serious evidence of inappropriate sexual harassment, which begs the valid question about the Prime Minister's own state of mind at that time. If the Prime Minister had held General Vance to a standard of zero tolerance for Me Too allegations, he would have to have held himself to the same standard. He wasn't prepared to do that, and so he looked the other way. Isn't it true that the Prime Minister decided to sacrifice women who were being sexually victimized in the military in order to protect himself?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we will always take strong actions when it comes to protecting our women in the Canadian Armed Forces. But last week, we learned some very troubling news. Prime Minister Harper appointed General Vance in July 2015, even though he was under active investigation by CFNIS. And just days after the Conservatives appointed him, the investigation was suddenly dropped. Now, according to an ATIP, the commanding officer said that he was under pressure. Now, by who? The leader of the opposition says he passed along sexual misconduct allegation by General Vance in July 2015, claiming that they were being looked into. So how is it possible if Vance was appointed at that time, even though there was an investigation that was currently going on? Thank you.
The Honourable Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Well, here's what we know happened since 2018 when the Prime Minister's office knew about these allegations. The Prime Minister publicly praised General Vance for his leadership of Operation Honour. He signed off on making him the longest-serving Chief of Defence Staff. He even signed off on a $50,000 raise. All the while, apparently, his Chief of Staff knew there was sexual misconduct allegations against the General. So are we to believe that Katie Telford kept the Prime Minister in the dark about sexual misconduct allegations while she watched him reward, praise, and even promote General Vance?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I said at committee, no, I did not know the nature of these specific details. I repeat that Mr. Walburn brought up concerns of misconduct involving the former Chief of Defence Staff. He did not give me any details. But you know who had the details, Mr. Speaker? The leader of the official opposition knew rumors in 2015 regarding General Vance that he felt were very serious enough for the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff to know about. Perhaps he should learn. Perhaps we should learn what details the leader of the opposition knew at that time. Thank you.
Honorable Député de Louis Saint Laurent.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, this unfortunate story about General Vance and sexual misconduct against women in the Army, well, the Liberals are continuing their odious cover-up. This morning, the National Defence Committee was supposed to meet to discuss the issue. But what did the Liberal government do? Through the Liberal chair of the committee, it completely cancelled the meeting. Mr. Speaker, that's completely unacceptable. Why are these Liberals continuing the cover-up of the sad story of sexual misconduct against women in the armed forces? The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's the chair of the committee. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Carleton, Canada, please proceed.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I respect the work of all my colleagues on all committees, and I take my responsibilities as chair of the National Defense Committee very seriously, and I've worked hard to serve the members of the committee in an unbiased way. This should be about improving the lives of the women and men of CAF. It should be about respecting and supporting the survivors and those impacted by this abominable behavior, and it should be about preventing more abuse and trauma. The committee is developing recommendations for the government to this end, and the committee will be meeting later this week. Thank you.
Honorable député de...
The honourable member for Louise Saint-Laurent.
Best way to go deep inside into the reality is to shut down the committee, as the honourable member did this morning. Monsieur le Président, si la députée est prête...
Mr. Speaker, if my colleague is ready to answer questions, perhaps she can explain why the Chief of Staff received on March 2nd, 2018, an email which said textually that this was a case of sexual harassment, whereas the Prime Minister keeps telling us that for 3 years no one up in his office seemed to know that it was a matter of sexual harassment. According to the chair of the committee, who is telling the truth?
Mr. Speaker, as I said at committee, that I did not know the nature of the specifics of the details. However, and I want to repeat, Mr. Walburn brought up concerns of misconduct involving the former Chief of Defense Staff. He did not give any details. But you know who had the details, Mr. Speaker? The leader of the official opposition knew of rumors back in 2015 regarding General Vance that he felt were so serious enough that he had to inform the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. Perhaps we should learn more about these details from the leader of the official opposition. Thank you.
L'honorable député de la Prairie.
The honourable member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, the culture of silence in the Army is extremely concerning. Yesterday, ex-Ombudsman Gary Walburn repeated that he had clearly specified to the Minister of Defense that he had received a complaint about inappropriate sexual behavior concerning former Chief of Defense Staff Vance. He repeated that the Minister refused to examine the complaint. He says that he doesn't know, but he refused to look at the complaint. He defended himself by saying that the subject of the complaint was not important. Does the minister realize that he contributed to the culture of silence in the forces? The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are absolutely committed to rooting out any type of misconduct from the Canadian Armed Forces. As I stated before, and at committee, that did not know the nature of the specifics of the case, that Mr. Walburn brought up concerns of misconduct involving the former Chief of Defense Staff. And then immediately, Mr. Speaker, we took action. And then that action was followed up the following day, Mr. Speaker, by PCO officials to contact Mr. Walburn so that further action could be taken. Thank you.
L'honorable député de la Prairie.
The honourable member for La Prairie. When you don't want to listen, it's easy to turn a deaf ear. The minister appointed Louise Arbour to address a culture of silence that he himself embodies. He voluntarily turned his eyes away from this complaint regarding the ex-Chief of Defense Staff. He was brought the allegations, but he refused to become aware of them. How does he think that Madame Arbour will judge people acting like him? He is the reflection at cabinet of the culture of silence in the Army. Does he really think that Madame Arbour will decide that he is part of the solution? The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to be very clear, and I disagree with the assertions that the member is making. Any misconduct is taken extremely seriously, Mr. Speaker, and that's exactly what we did to take immediate action. But no politician should ever be involved in any type of investigation for any type of interference, Mr. Speaker. That information was followed up immediately, and by the very next day, the Privy Council followed up. Any allegations that were ever brought to my attention was immediately and always acted upon. Thank you.
The honourable member for North Island Powell River.
Mr. Speaker, the issue of sexual misconduct in the Canadian Forces is fundamentally about equality. While there is a culture that tolerates sexual misconduct, women cannot serve equally. In this House, the Liberals and Conservatives are arguing about who failed the most on this file. Service women, all women deserve better. This requires action. With the utmost respect to Justice Arbour, service women do not need another report. Why have the Minister and Prime Minister ignored the survivors in favor of protecting General Vance?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Armed Forces members make enormous sacrifices to protect Canadians regardless of rank or gender and have an undeniable right to serve with safety. It is clear that we have not lived up to our responsibility to protect our members from misconduct, and we will do better. That's why we've announced that Madame Louise Arbour will lead an independent external comprehensive review into harassment and sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces and DND. And we've also named Lieutenant General Janine Carillon as the Chief Professional Conduct and Culture. These are just the first few steps that we're taking, Mr. Speaker. We have more work to do, and we will get it done. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for London Fanshawe.
Last week, the Liberals offered up their solution to the toxic sexual culture against women in the armed forces. Another report. Maybe they forgot that we already have a report. Actually, we have several. But the Deschamps report has been collecting dust for 6 years, while women continue to experience unfair treatment while doing their best to serve our country. Women in Canada's armed forces deserve a government that will protect them, not one that is only willing to protect their own image. Will the Prime Minister commit to finally implementing the recommendations in the Deschamps report like they promised years ago?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are absolutely committed to making sure that we have an inclusive environment for all, and especially women in the Canadian Armed Forces, and that we have absolutely no tolerance for misconduct. And through the institutional culture change is complex, but the time for patience is over to get this done. That's why I've announced that we're also creating a new internal organization led by Lieutenant General Professional Conduct and Culture. She will be tasked with unifying, integrating, and coordinating all policies, programs, and activities that currently address systemic misconduct and support culture change across all national defence and Canadian Armed Forces. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge.
The Liberals recently changed their own legislation, Bill C-10. They removed the one section that safeguarded individuals from online government censorship. Why?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to quote the Conservative member for Saskatoon Grassroot on November 19, who said, "The legislation does nothing to address social media companies such as Facebook and Google and their various properties such as YouTube to pay its fair share." And he even added on March 26 to the Professional Music Publishers Association, "You're right about YouTube. It's not regulated in Bill C-10 and everybody's using YouTube. We're going to have an issue. As you pointed out correctly, this should be regulated and it is not." I agree with the Conservative member for Saskatoon Grassroot, Mr. Speaker. I'm only saddened by the fact that his own party doesn't.
Member for Lethbridge.
It's sad that the minister still doesn't have an answer to this question. It's been asked for days now, and still he continues to point to big organizations like Google and Facebook, rather than talking about the protection of individual rights and freedoms, which is the question at hand. For bills like C-10, they're put through a sniff test, which means that the Justice Department goes through them and decides whether or not they adhere to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I put forward a motion last week at committee asking that there be another review done to this bill because it has substantially undergone change. Experts have stated that we need a new evaluation from the Justice Minister to determine if C-10 respects the Charter. Does the Minister agree?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I find it incredibly hypocritical that the member of Lethbridge, who, given the opportunity, would not hesitate 1 minute to remove women's right to choose, a right protected under the Charter of Rights and Freedom, but would like us and Canadians to believe that all of a sudden she cares deeply about said charter. I have rarely seen such hypocrisy before in my life, Mr. Speaker.
Unbelievable. Seriously, that.
Order. 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 We have a point of order not usually carried during question period unless it's a technical issue. Maybe the honourable member wants to bring it up after. But I mean, there's no, I just want to, I have a good feeling of where the honourable member wants to go, but the proceedings, in order to continue, take a certain amount of respect amongst individuals. And when someone speaks on a microphone,
we cannot hear you for those who are not in the chamber. Maybe Mr. Speaker is speechless.
Okay, let's try this again. I believe the technician had to resort to muting everyone, including the speaker, which is not a good way to run a chamber. I'm sure you'll all agree, but we have to have some respect for each other. And heckling online in a virtual setting really breaks everything up. And respect does go both ways. I'll agree with the honourable member. The honourable member for Lethbridge.
Again, because this minister lacks answers to the real questions that Canadians have, he resorts to attacking me on a very personal level. It's incredibly inappropriate, and I look forward to his apology at the end of the day. Nevertheless, at committee last week, Conservatives put forward a motion that would ensure that this newly modified bill is still compliant with the Charter and protects the fundamental rights and freedoms of Canadians. As legislators, this is our utmost responsibility. It is always the right thing to contend for Canadians' charter rights. Nevertheless, the Liberals shut down debate on our important motion last week. Why?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to quote the Canadian Diversity for the Cultural Expression that said that Bill 10 on broadcasting has come under unprecedented attack in recent days from the Conservative Party, and that the Conservative Party is sacrificing Canadian culture on the altar of partnership. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Richmond.
The honourable member for Richmond Athabasca. Mr. Speaker, there is an extremely long list of experts who have come out categorically against the new Liberal version of C10, a former CRTC commissioner, former national commissioners of the CRTC, lawyers, university professors, free speech experts. They've all said that C10 goes much too far and that it crosses a line. Why do the minister and the Liberal government refuse to listen to these experts? The honourable minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to quote the leader of the Publishers Association. He said that my colleague and the Conservative Party of Canada have chosen partisanship over Canadian culture. The study of C10 is not even over. Freedom of speech is not threatened. The only party that is threatening freedom of speech is yours. It's purely political. The Conservative Party of Canada cares more about the web giants than our culture. The honourable member for Richmond Athabasca. Mr. Speaker, whether the minister wants to admit it or not, the list of opponents grows day after day, and the minister knows that very well. And he also knows that his new version of C10 doesn't do anything to protect freedom of speech. In fact, it undermines it. It's an affront to our democracy. I will quote Michael Geist, emeritus law professor at the University of Ottawa. He said, "This is the most anti-internet government in the history of Canada." That's not the Conservative Party saying that. It's Michael Geist, emeritus law professor. Why won't this minister and his government listen to experts? Period. The honourable minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This time, I will quote the president of the Federation of Communications and Culture, who said directly to the honourable member for Richmond Athabasca. He said, "With all due respect, we had many discussions where you agreed with C10. You helped us flesh out the bill. You know that this bill does not target users of social media or threaten freedom of expression. The cultural sector is counting on you to explain this to your Conservative colleagues and to cease engaging in demagogic tactics. We need to protect Canadian culture. Don't let us down." But unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party has let down artists and Canadian culture. The honourable member for Richmond Athabasca. Listening to the minister, well, it makes me want to laugh, Mr. Speaker. He is rejecting the opinions of all the experts in the country who have spoken up all week. He's trying to defend the indefensible. Let's be very clear. C10 does not regulate copyright. It does not make web giants pay. It does not review the role of CBC Radio-Canada. With the surprise amendments made to C10 last week without warning, he is giving even more power to the CRTC. He's letting it censor users of social networks. That's the truth. Why does this minister stubbornly insist on going in this direction? Why doesn't he listen to experts once and for all? The honourable minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And now I would like to quote the head of an organization for cultural diversity and expression, who's addressed my colleague saying that the CRTC has never regulated content on Canadian TV and radio, that it has never limited freedom of expression on the airwaves, and that this legislation will not enable the CRTC to do so. And yet, the Conservative Party of Canada is the only party that continues to spread this fake news. It's extremely, extremely unfortunate, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. Mr. Speaker, the deadline for tax returns has now passed, and that's concerning for victims of CERB fraud. They shouldn't have to pay tax on sums that they have neither requested nor received. That should be obvious. However, the CRA is telling them, pay first, we'll investigate, and then if you have been victims of fraud, we'll pay you back later. Mr. Speaker, could the minister instead tell victims that it's not their fault, that they don't have to pay anything until the investigations are over, and that they will not be forced to pay a penalty? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I would like to reassure my honourable colleague. I will tell him that the number of tax returns submitted until up to date is similar to the number before the pandemic. Now that that tax season for individuals is over, it is important that they submit all necessary documents to avoid having their benefits interrupted. The Honourable Member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. Mr. Speaker, I suppose that was supposed to be an answer, but we need a clear answer for victims. First of all, the minister could have put off the tax deadline in order to leave time for the investigations, but she refused. She could have clearly said that people could wait before having to pay taxes on fraudulent sums. She is refusing to tell victims what to expect. People saw the Phoenix pay system fiasco, so they don't want to send off a check to Ottawa on the basis of promises that it will be repaid later, because they know that it could take years. Why is this minister refusing to take victim's side? The Honourable Minister. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to remind my colleague that the CRA has already assured fraud victims that they will not have to pay. In fact, until April 2022, there will be no interest or penalties for people who have submitted their tax return. And I would encourage people to submit their tax return so that they can get the credits and benefits that they have a right to, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member. Mr. Speaker, last year, Revenue Quebec managed to find more money in tax havens from the Panama Papers than the CRA did for all of Canada. So I have a suggestion for the minister. Instead of harassing victims of CERB fraud, as she is currently doing, she's harassing them, could she just leave them in peace until the investigations are over? And could she instead invest her energy in fighting tax havens instead of poisoning the lives of honest taxpayers? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I am frustrated to hear the Bloc Québécois implying that people shouldn't submit their tax returns. That would leave the most vulnerable Canadians without the credits that they need. Now, regarding the Panama Papers, 900 Canadians have been identified. 160 audits are currently being carried out. We are on the right path, Mr. Speaker.
For Calgary Nose Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. NACI is recommending mRNA vaccines over the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson vaccine in a press conference given moments ago, saying that given reports of blood clotting, individuals should be able to, quote, make an informed choice on if they should wait to take an mRNA vaccine. And a representative from NACI actually said they don't know how common the incidence of blood clotting is with those two vaccines, suggesting that they might be as high as 1 in 100,000. So what does Health Canada advise? This is a lot different from what we've been hearing. Taking the first vaccine offered, or wait if you can for an mRNA vaccine?
The Honourable Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, I'd like to thank NACI for their ongoing work in helping provinces and territories determine how to deliver the vaccines that are approved for use in Canada. As a member opposite might realize from listening to witness testimonies at Health Canada or at the HESA committee, Health Canada is responsible for approving vaccines for use in Canada and have given specific use requirements. NACI then takes the evidence and provides advice on how best to administer it. If any Canadian is questioning whether a vaccine is right for them, the best place to get information is from their healthcare professional.
The honourable member for Calgary, Nose Hill.
I think that's going to leave a lot of Canadians even more confused than the press conference that just happened. So I'm going to ask again, because the minister is responsible for Health Canada. So NACI is saying individuals should be able to make an informed choice on if they should take AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson or wait for an mRNA vaccine. But she's been saying take the first vaccine that's offered. So what is the advice from Health Canada? Take the first vaccine that's offered, no matter what it is, or if you can work from home or whatever, wait for an mRNA vaccine. What is it?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's somewhat disconcerting to see the member opposite try to instill fear in our healthcare institutions that, of course, guide patients towards the best medication for them. These vaccines are being delivered by healthcare professionals who know how to screen and ask the correct questions and to determine which vaccine is indeed the best for that particular patient. And for her to imply that patients would not get that expertise advice from their medical professionals is really a lack of confidence in all of our provincial and territorial partners who are doing so much work to ensure that Canadians get the right vaccine for them.
L'honorable député de Charbot.
The honourable member for Charles-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, we learned today that, on the orders of the Prime Minister, the chair of the Defence Committee cancelled the meeting of the committee that was supposed to be held today. Her contempt for the parliamentary process is clear, because she didn't even give committee members a reason for this cancellation. This is another shameful attempt by the Liberals to cover up for the Prime Minister's inaction on sexual misconduct in the forces. From one lieutenant colonel to another, when will the chair stop covering up for Katie Telford? When will she call for another meeting of the committee?
Mr. Speaker, I have all the respect to work done.
Did you send it to Sajan?
Order. Order. I'm not sure exactly where that language came from, but I believe we as parliamentarians deserve an apology. Now, order. I believe the government House Leader has something to bring up. I'll let him.
Monsieur le Président, tel que mentionné par mes collègues.
Mr. Speaker, as my colleagues have pointed out, I was the source of that language. That is unacceptable, and I'm sorry.
I want to remind all the honourable members that if they're not answering or asking a question, please put their mics on mute. The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
No, Mr. Speaker. If the chair can't answer the question, I'll be happy to answer the question.
Wait a minute, one second. Oh, I'm sorry. The Honourable Minister of Defence is answering the question.
But it was a question to the chair of the committee.
One moment, please.
Mr. Speaker.
After consulting with the table officers, the question was not directly answered at the chair of the committee. But if she wants to, I guess I can leave it. I'll leave it up to her to decide.
Yes, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to assure my colleague that the Defence Committee will be meeting at its normal time this coming Friday at 1 o'clock. Thank you.
The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, a national action plan to implement the calls to justice in response to the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is almost 2 years late. And every time I try and get an update from the minister, she tells me she's working on it. Another woman goes missing or murdered. I'm working on it. A girl goes missing, leaving their family searching for their loved one. We're making progress. A 2S LGBTQIA individual is beaten. I'm working on it. This liberal stalling is costing lives. When will this government release a national action plan to address this ongoing genocide?
Honourable Minister.
I thank the member for her concern, and our hearts are with all the families and survivors in this ongoing tragedy. There is no question that the 100 Indigenous women and Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA plus people working on this plan were very, very pleased to see $2.2 billion put in last week's budget to be able to put in place the concrete actions that will stop this tragedy.
The Honourable Member for Churchill, Kiiwetinoong-Aski.
Mr. Speaker, last week at committee, bureaucrats said the government won't have long-term solutions to clean drinking water on reserve before 2026, 5 years after they promised. This is an unacceptable failure by the Prime Minister and his government. The minister at least acknowledges, saying, quote, "It's unacceptable in a country that is financially one of the most wealthy in the world," unquote. Agreed, Minister, it is. So can the minister outline what lessons he's learned during the last 5 years of failure that will allow him to deliver on a promise to end these inhumane conditions in 2021 by 2026?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And let me be clear, our government is not and will not abandon our commitment to ensuring First Nations on reserve have access to safe and clean drinking water. The plan is working, and together we've lifted 106 long-term advisories and have prevented 180 short-term advisories from becoming long-term. I want to assure Canadians, Mr. Speaker, and First Nations that in every community with a long-term drinking water advisory, there is a project team and action plan in place to resolve it. Our government stands with First Nations to ensure another generation does not have to grow up without clean drinking water.
The Honourable Member for Scarborough Agincourt.
May is Asian Heritage Month in Canada, and it is a time to commemorate all the achievements and contributions Asian Canadians have made for this country. However, spurred on by pandemic fears, anti-Asian racism continues to rise in Canada, including in Scarborough, where earlier this month a man was sent to the hospital after being assaulted at a restaurant, and graffiti was found outside the Chinese Cultural Centre of Greater Toronto. That is why today I am asking the Minister of Diversity, Inclusion and Youth, what is our government doing to combat anti-Asian racism?
The Honourable Minister.
The member for Scarborough Agincourt's work to combat anti-Asian racism remains necessary and is noticed. This year marks the 20th anniversary of May as Asian Heritage Month, yet Canadians of Asian descent continue to face violence fueled by ignorance. Our government implemented Canada's anti-racism strategy, including the Anti-Racism Secretariat, launched the Digital Citizen Initiative to counter anti-Asian racism. And through Budget 2021, the Canadian Race Relations Foundation will establish a national coalition of Asian Canadian communities and create a fund for racialized communities impacted by the increased acts of racism during the pandemic. This Asian Heritage Month, I urge all to stand together against anti-Asian racism. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the government claims they are working to ensure that Enbridge Line 5 is not shut down on May 12th. We've been calling for the Prime Minister to get involved in this file for 6 months. Last week, the National Post reported officials are frustrated by how much time they are spending on the matter. Well, Mr. Speaker, Canadians are frustrated by the lack of results from this government. May 12th is a mere 9 days away, and so far the Prime Minister has not been engaged with the President. With 25,000 jobs at risk, when will the Prime Minister recognize the urgency of solving this issue?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member for his question. Line 5 is non-negotiable. People will not be left out in the cold. I'd like to thank the members of the Canada-US Special Committee for their hard work on studying Line 5. We have received the report, we are reviewing it, but it is clear that there is no daylight between parties and between Canadians on this issue. Line 5 is essential for Canada's energy security. Line 5 is not just vital for Canada, not just vital for the United States, but for North America. We will stop at nothing to make sure that this is not shut down. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, those are words and nice sounding words, but the minister and now this parliamentary secretary keeps stating that keeping Line 5 open is non-negotiable, and yet we are still in limbo. The environmental impact of shutting down Line 5 would be devastating. It would require 15,000 trucks and 800 rail cars per day to replace the supply shortage. For a government that claims to be addressing climate change, they are simply sitting under a tree waiting for others to do their job. Can the Prime Minister tell us what is the plan to keep this vital infrastructure open?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to assure the House that we are looking at all the options. We will leave no stone unturned in defending Canada's energy security. We are working on the political level, the diplomatic level, and the legal level. We are ready to intervene at precisely the right moment. Line 5 is non-negotiable. We're standing up for energy workers and for Canada's energy security. People will not be left out on the cold, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Last week at committee, the Minister of International Development claimed that hateful content in UNRWA-produced materials was not produced by UNRWA and was removed last year. But a February impact report demonstrates the continuing presence of hateful content in UNRWA-produced study materials, materials which denounce Arab states over the Abraham Accords and call for the banishment of Jews from Israel. Could the minister confirm that she is now aware that hateful content persists in UNRWA-produced materials and tell the House what she intends to do about it?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I have said numerous times, this government stands against anti-Semitism, and we have been very clear about that. As soon as I learned about this material, I was deeply concerned, and I contacted my officials as well as UNRWA itself to get to the bottom of this. I have been in touch with counterparts around the world, and we are working with UNRWA to ensure that the materials that they teach that are provided by the jurisdiction in which they operate meet UN values and uphold the principles of neutrality. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Mr. Speaker, the minister says she takes anti-Semitism seriously, but her government is funding it in UNRWA-produced study materials. Again, these are UNRWA-produced study materials. The European Parliament has denounced UNRWA for hateful comments and study materials that it produces and continues to use. But the minister still is badly mischaracterizing the situation by referring to Palestinian Authority textbooks. She had promised an investigation. She's failing to follow up. And Canadian taxpayer dollars are still funding anti-Semitic hate. So when will the minister recognize what is happening and actually take action in response?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I have communicated to the House on several occasions, we take this issue with the utmost seriousness and have been engaged as soon as we learned of this issue. I continue to engage with UNRWA on this, but let me remind the honourable member, UNRWA provides education to 500,000 Palestinian students. Without UNRWA, they would not have access to education. We remain absolutely committed to upholding UN values, the principle of neutrality. We will continue to work with UNRWA to ensure that these objectives are met, but we also know that they provide a valuable service to 500,000 Palestinian children.
L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, the pandemic is not an excuse for immigration failures. Currently, new refugees are being separated from their children for months or up to 2 years because of federal delays. Canada is leaving children behind in countries where conditions are often unsafe, while their parents wait for a decision from Ottawa to finally repatriate them. In addition to the trauma of separation, these children are often subjected to mistreatment and abuse. I know the minister does not condone the violation of the International Convention on the Rights of the Child, so what is he doing to quickly reunite these families and protect these vulnerable children? The Honourable Minister.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud of our asylum system. We have made a lot of investments in the system. over the last 3 years, Canada is the country that has done the most work on repatriation of refugees, including children, and we will continue to play a leadership role on this. It seems that we lost the minister there. I think most of the question was answered. Could the minister perhaps just repeat the last 10 or 15 seconds of his answer?
No, on l'a perdu.
No, I'm afraid we lost him. Well, we'll continue with the honourable member for Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, it's the most vulnerable people who are the victims of federal immigration problems. The delays are jeopardizing a formal objective that the Prime Minister set out for the Minister of Immigration in his mandate letter. He asked that the files of 250 human rights activists, aid workers, and journalists who are put at risk by oppressive regimes be fast-tracked. A year and a half later, this fast-tracking program still doesn't exist and might never exist if there were to be an early election. What is the minister doing to ensure that these people will not fall victim to his party's electoral agenda? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, as I already said, Canada has played a leadership role in defending human rights. We are the country that has done the most work to help refugees over the last 3 years. And we will continue making investments and investing resources in order to continue protecting all refugees. That is the work that I am doing in along with my counterparts in Quebec.
Grey Bruce Owen Sound.
Mr. Speaker, I was already disappointed watching the Liberal filibuster Defense Committee last Friday that is preventing key testimony from the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. I was shocked to see this morning the chair cancel the committee meetings for today. When I have former female Canadian Armed Forces officers reaching out to me in reaction to this lack of accountability and failure of leadership and stating that this is a nightmare that never ends, this cover-up needs to stop. From one former officer to another, will the defense chair stop the cover-up and tell Parliament why she canceled Defense Committee this morning and why she won't allow a vote in calling Katie Telford to testify?
The Honourable Minister.
I thank the honourable member for his question today, and I want to assure him that I respect all the work that being done by all colleagues and all committees. And really, this should be about improving the lives of the women and men in the Canadian Forces. It should be about supporting the survivors and those impacted by this abominable behavior, and it should be about preventing its further abuse. And the committee will continue its work and coming up with recommendations for the government, and the committee meets on Friday at its regular time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The correctional service is in crisis. Local guards in my constituency are reaching out to me describing the situation at the Drumheller Institution as a powder keg. There's been a lack of direction related to COVID-19, inconsistent and changing rules for employees and inmates, PPE being turned into weapons, and reductions to needed staff services. This has left many CSC employees working in an impossible environment where they have even been told to eat in the bathroom to stay safe. Will the minister take action today to fix these challenges?
The Honourable Minister.
I thank Mr. Speaker, I thank the member opposite for his concern for our correction workers and our inmates. We share that concern. And I'm very pleased to tell him that the Correction Services Canada has done extraordinary work throughout the entire course of the pandemic to ensure that people working in our corrections facilities were provided with personal protection equipment, that we did audits and safety audits at each of our facilities. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, they have now all been prioritized by our government for vaccinations, and we're moving ahead very quickly to ensure inmates and our correction workers are all vaccinated. We'll take every step to protect the people working in our correction services. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Oshawa.
Mr. Speaker, Durham Region was shaken by 2 shootings in Ajax last week, which appear to be gang-related. According to Statistics Canada, the number of gang-related murders since the Liberals first took office has been higher every single year than any year under the previous Conservative government. The Liberal government's soft-on-crime approach through bills like C-22 and C-75 has made Canada a safe haven for gang activity. Mr. Speaker, when will caring about gang violence, the true source of gun crime in Canada, become a priority for this Liberal government?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to hear of the member from Oshawa's concern. And he may recall that we introduced a budget that provided $327 million to law enforcement in this country, both the federal police and provincial and municipal police services, to do gun and gang investigations. And unfortunately, the member from Oshawa voted against it. We've also brought forward a new measure to provide for $250 million for community organizations working in the community to reduce gun and gang violence. And I'm very sincerely hopeful that this time he may find it in his heart to provide that support. Mr. Speaker, the police and our community organizations are doing extraordinary work, and we'll support them.
The honourable member for Glengarry Prescott Russell.
In 2016, Canadians from coast to coast, including in my riding of Glengarry Prescott Russell, responded enthusiastically to the return of the long-form census, with one of the highest response rates in recorded history. The COVID-19 pandemic underscores the vital role that reliable, high-quality data plays in helping governments, businesses, nonprofit organizations, and researchers make informed decisions. Unlike the Stephen Harper Conservatives, who needlessly abandoned the long-form questionnaire and cut funding to StatsCan, our government understands the vital importance of science and data. Would the Minister for Science, or rather Innovation, Science and Industry, please inform this House of the status of the next census? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my honourable colleague for his excellent question. I'm very pleased to announce that starting today, the 2021 census is officially underway. Our government has invested in modernizing Statistics Canada to maintain its ability to provide relevant and world-class data. Statistics Canada officials have worked tirelessly to adapt to the realities of COVID-19. I encourage all Canadians to visit census.gc.ca to learn more about the 2021 census and to help plan the future together. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Heritage Minister quoted me asking to stop child sexual abuse material on Pornhub to justify his free speech attack in Bill C-10. The criminal code defines child pornography. Websites break the law with such vile videos and images. But rather than going after companies profiting from child exploitation and non-consensual videos, the Liberals decided they'll go after Canadians' Facebook posts instead. How can the Liberals use the failure to charge, prosecute, and convict on child sexual abuse material as an excuse for their assault on Canadian rights and freedoms?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the question. And the member opposite will be happy to learn that I will be tabling legislation on online harms in the coming week, Mr. Speaker. But on the issue of cultural production and the fact that web giants should be paying their fair share, as I was quoting earlier, her colleague, the member for Saskatoon Grassroots, has stated that he wanted us to do that, and we're doing exactly that. But you know what's happening, Mr. Speaker? The Conservative Party got cold feet. Google, YouTube are very powerful company, and when the going got tough, they ran for the hill. We're standing up for Canadians artists, for Canadian music, and for Canadian culture, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dufferin-Caledon.
Mr. Speaker, they say imitation is the finest form of flattery, and if so, George Orwell must be blushing with the Liberals' Orwellian attempt through Bill C-10 to control internet content and social media. A few days ago, the minister embarrassingly and incoherently attempted to justify the inclusion of user content in the bill. Canadians are rightfully outraged. Will the minister dump this bill or reprotect user content or insult me like he insulted the member from Lethbridge, or will he again try to explain this inexplainable infringement on Canadians' freedoms?
Good question. The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, what I would do is quote his colleague, the Conservative MP for Saskatoon Grassroots, and I'll say it again. I think this needs to sink in. I quote, "The legislation does nothing to address social media companies such as Facebook and Google and their various properties such as YouTube to pay its fair share." And then he added 10 days later to the Professional Music Publishers Association, "You're right about YouTube. It's not regulated in Bill C-10 and everybody's using YouTube. We are going to have an issue. As you pointed out correctly, this should be regulated, Mr. Speaker. That's what the Conservative member for Saskatoon Grassroots has said. I agree with him, not with the most radical elements of the Conservative Party of Canada.
The Honourable Member for Montmagny-Lillet, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Mr. Speaker, the government is insisting on using the Broadcasting Act to give itself the power to regulate the content of social media, although they are not broadcast on any public airwaves. The internet was supposed to give people the freedom to express themselves. Even Heritage Canada saw fit to exempt YouTube and Facebook from the new CRTC rules. So why did the Liberals insist that they could be censored after all? The Honourable Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, this is another example of the Conservative Party continuing its misinformation campaign. An impressive number of stakeholders appeared before the committee to say that this legislation is necessary. This has nothing to do with regulating content. It has everything to do with getting the web giants to pay their fair share to support Quebec and Canadian culture. The Conservatives have decided to side with Google and YouTube, some of the biggest, richest companies in the world, to the detriment of our artists and our culture in Canada, and that's concerning.
Honourable Member for West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Mr. Speaker, while all Canadians have been hard hit by the pandemic, Canada's tourism sector has been perhaps the hardest hit. Not only were the people and businesses in this sector among the first to be impacted by COVID-19, when economies reopen, the tourism sector will still take some time to recover. Can the minister responsible for tourism tell this House how Budget 2021 will help our tourism sector rebound from the pandemic and come back stronger?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to thank my colleague from West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, and Sea to Sky Country for his question. We know that people working in the tourism sector have been extremely hard hit by the pandemic and the economic crisis, and that's why we heard their call for more help. That's why exactly we've announced in the budget that we would be providing $1 billion more in support for the tourism sector, including a tourism relief fund to help our local tourism businesses. We can't wait to welcome back Canadians and the world to our cities and regions when it's safe to do so. But meanwhile, people in the tourism industry can know that our government has their back. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Mr. Speaker, the big airlines continue to sit on billions of dollars of Canadians' hard-earned money for cancelled flights. For months, we called on the minister to help, but instead of siding with Canadians, he sided with the airlines, saying there was nothing he could do to force refunds. Now we have emails showing the government knew early on about gaps in the rules that allowed companies to keep Canadians' money, yet they waited half a year before even starting to make changes. Will the government explain to Canadians why it took so long to get them their money back?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our government continues to be committed to making sure that Canadians get their refunds. And we know that the airline sector has been hit very hard because of the pandemic. So we've been working with the Canadian Transportation Agency, with the aviation sector, with airlines on making sure that passengers receive their refund. And yes, the honourable member is referring to a letter written by my predecessor last December, but there's been a lot of work prior to that letter. He only sees the letter and he doesn't talk about the months and weeks of work that the previous minister and officials...
The Honourable Member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
Mr. Speaker, a grocery worker in a western province contacted me because his employer told him he can't come to work if he doesn't get the COVID vaccine. In the USA, the COVID vaccines are authorized under an emergency use authorization. And when a treatment is authorized in this way, it is illegal to force employees to take it. In Canada, we use a similar interim authorization for the vaccines. In the opinion of the minister, should this grocery clerk be fired if he chooses not to take the vaccine?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I will decline to comment on the specifics of the individual situation since I would like to understand more about his his concerns, but I will say this. There is no federal statute that compels people to get vaccinated. Different workplaces and different settings will require vaccination for a variety of illnesses. For example, many school boards require common childhood immunizations prior to a child being enrolled. These are not unprecedented decisions that employers in some settings have taken, and of course, none of them are federally decided upon.